In this video, I will show the breakdown and rebuild of a Predator 79cc 3 horsepower horizontal engine. Tools needed to break down and rebuild of the Predator engine. First thing, I have a 3/8 drive metric and standard socket set. You will also possibly need wrenches of the same metric and standard. I have 2 flat-headed screwdrivers, one number 2 Phillips head screwdriver, a pair of channel locks, a gear puller, oil pan, and then a container to put all parts and bolts in. First things first, I like to take the cover off of the muffler. This acts as a heat shield. What you'll need is a Phillips head. You got 4 screws right here. After you take this off, you will see the actual muffler and how it connects to the engine. Then get your muffler. Next, to take the muffler off, you will need to use a 10mm end wrench. There's 3 bolts around the header going into the muffler. These nuts have a small washer that need to be put on before the nut. Once the muffler is removed, you next could remove the header. This is a 13mm socket. Behind the header will be a gasket that is heat rated. There's also a gasket on top of the header going into the muffler. There's your gasket. Next, I like to take off the air filter cover. This has 2 hand screws that keep the cover on. Once these are removed, you will then see the air filter. Behind this, you will have 2 10mm nuts that need to be taken off to get to the choke and carburetor. After the 2 10mm nuts are taken off, you can go ahead and remove this. As you can see, there is another gasket. Normally you'd want to keep these gaskets if the engine's fairly new. If you see any breakage or deformity of the gasket, you might want to go ahead and order new gaskets for the whole engine. After that is done, next thing I like to do is take the fuel line off of the choke and carburetor. Usually you would use a pair of channel locks or Kleins. For this video, I've already taken it off. You would just wiggle this right on off of the stem. Once the fuel line is disconnected, you will need to take the 3 5/16 screws that hold on the fuel tank. Next thing to take off would be the heat shield. This has just 1 5/16 screw. After that is complete, I like to take the rod and 2 springs that are involved with the choke, throttle, and governor. This spring right here connects the governor control arm to the throttle. This spring and rod over here connect the governor to the choke. I like to take a 10mm socket and loosen this nut right here. This allows you to pull the governor control arm off to easily remove the rod and spring. After After the rod and spring have been taken off, you now can pull the choke off. This also has another gasket right here and a spacer with a gasket. This will free up room to take the flywheel cover off. Needed for this is a 15/16 socket. There are 4 bolts holding this on, located here, here, down here, and then there's one right here. As you can see, this one has a wire that has been grounded right behind the bolt, which is connected to the kill switch. After the flywheel cover is pulled off, you can see that there is a wire running from the kill switch all the way to the magneto. That needs to be pulled off of the magneto and set aside the cover to protect it. Now you can pull the spark plug wire off of the spark plug. All you need to do is just wiggle it, pops right off. Then you will need a 13/16 spark plug socket. It's a special socket to fit on the spark plug without messing it up. Couple turns, open it up, and you should be able to screw it off by hand. Now there's 2 15/16 holding the magneto to the frame of the engine. Those need to be removed. This whole piece is called the cylinder head. To take this off, you need to take 4 12mm bolts out.
Now that the cylinder head has been removed, as you can see there are 2 pins right here. These are called the valve lifters. Next, you have your valve adjusting bolts. They're located right here. There's 2 of them. Next, you have these little things right here, as they're called valve rockers. Behind those, then you have your valve springs.
This is the flywheel nut. To take this off, you will need to use a 11/16 socket. This right here is the starter pulley. When you pull the cable to start the engine, a gear will come out and catch into one of these little notches. This right here is the impeller. It is plastic. And then you have your flywheel. To get this off, you will now have to use the puller. Now that the puller is on the flywheel, you will turn the puller in tightening rotation. You might hear a loud pop. Don't be alarmed, it's just it coming off the shaft. Just like that. Your flywheel is off the shaft. Before you can take the crankcase cover off, you would need to drain the oil out of this plug. This right here is where you would check the level of your oil and or fill it. For the purpose of this video, the oil has already been drained. This is when you will need 2 flathead screwdrivers to properly pry the crankcase cover off of the engine. There is a gasket that seals all the way around the crankcase cover that is pretty much like vacuum sealed. So you want to pry on opposite sides to evenly pull the crankcase cover off without messing up the gasket too much. First though, you would need to remove the key. If you don't, the crankcase cover will not be able to slide off the shaft. Just like that, it has come loose, then you may pull that off. Then you receive all the intestines of the engine. This video will show how the piston moves inside of the engine. Now with the crankcase cover pulled off, you can remove your camshaft. Before you do this, you need to mark on the camshaft and the crankshaft where the teeth line up. This is because of timing. Usually the factory will mark the crankshaft, but not the camshaft. So I went ahead and marked 3 on the camshaft and 2 on the crankshaft. Now you'll be able to remove the camshaft by just popping it out. Next, we will take the crankshaft out. To remove the connecting rod, this piece, you will need a 10mm wrench. It has 2 bolts, one right here and one right here. With those bolts removed, this piece will pop off and allow the piston to pull out. Since the piston is now removed from the crankshaft, you will now be able to just pull the crankshaft out. The last thing in the engine is the governor. You have the governor rod right here. Like before, I talked about it connected to the lever. You have the gear, and then you have the 2 flyweights. When I spin this gear, you will see the flyweights open up and then come back to the resting position. That concludes the complete teardown of the Predator 79cc engine. Now to put the engine back together, we'll pretty much do everything in the reverse order, starting with the crankshaft. Slide it in this hole, and it seats itself. The piston goes next. As you can see, there's an arrow that needs to be face down. Slide this in, and it will stop right here. There are little rings that need to be compressed in order for the piston to slide in the engine. To do this, I use a flathead screwdriver. You need to work all the way around it while also keeping pressure on the piston. So that's the first one. You have 2 more. Do the same process. The camshaft is now ready to be installed. Like I said before, the marks on the gears of the camshaft and the crankshaft need to line up for timing to be correct. Just like that. The crankcase cover will go on. It just slides on and it should seat itself. Just like that. Then you put your 6 5/16 screws in and tighten them down. The last thing to make this whole engine complete will be the cover for the muffler. You can make sure that this hole right here lines up with the hole in the muffler. Once that is done, the 4 Phillips head screws need to be started to hold the cover down. Once all 4 started, you can tighten them down to the proper torque. Just like that, the Predator 79cc horizontal engine, 3 horsepower motor is all rebuilt and in operating condition. The next thing to take off would be the heat shield. This is another 5/16 screw. This covers the cylinder head and protects heat from getting to the fuel tank After the rod and spring have been taken off, you now can pull the choke off. This also has another gasket right here and a spacer with a gasket. Since the piston is now removed from the crankshaft, you will now be able to just pull the crankshaft out. Here's the complete teardown of the Predator 79cc engine. Flywheel will go on next. You need to line this groove right here up with the keyway that is in the shaft. Just like that, it slid on the keyway. Once the crankcase shaft is on, you will now put the cylinder head. As you can see, there is a gasket. It has 2 pins that line the gasket up the correct way. These 2 valve lifters will slide down and they will seat in a hole like that. Then you will need to pull the valve rocker over top of the lifter pin. Just like that. Then you put the 4 bolts back in. You can then put the cover back on. Flywheel will go on next. You need to line this groove right here up with the keyway that is in the shaft. Just like that, it slid on the keyway. You will put the impeller on next. As you can see, there is a notch taken out of the impeller that will line up with the magnet on the flywheel. Just like that. Then you have the starter pulley that will have that hole line up with that little tick. Now the nut, the flywheel. This is again a 11/16 nut that needs to be tightened pretty well. Next, the magneto will be installed. To make it easier, you want to make sure that the magnet is moved away from the magneto. This again is a 5/16 bolt, 2 of them. Spark plug will go next. So you should start to thread this by hand so that you don't cross thread it. Once you know that it is in there solid, you can go ahead and put your socket that is specially made for spark plugs on. plug wire need to be run behind this little ear and around and connected to the spark plug. Before the flywheel cover goes back on, you need to remember to attach this wire onto the magneto. It should just slide on and you'll feel it pop. That's when you know it's good. Then the choke can be put on. First, you need to make sure that you put a gasket. And a spacer. Then the other gasket, which is already attached to the choke, facing the spacer. Next, the air filter will be put on. Before putting the air filter on, this green gasket will need to be installed. As you can see, the holes on the gasket are a little worn down. So if I had another gasket, I would put it on, but I'm just going to use this one for demonstration. Next goes backing. Then the two 10mm nuts. As you can see, there is a hose coming off of the cylinder head. This needs to be put into the back of the air filter. You might need to use a screwdriver to pry the hose in, just like that. Next will be the actual air filter. This will be put in just like this. And then the cover. When installing the cover, you need to make sure that the run stop sign is pointed up towards your choke lever. Now the governor control arm, along with the rod and spring, can be installed to the choke. You use a 10mm socket to tighten down this nut on the governor control arm. Then, the spring connecting to the throttle from the governor control arm will be installed. You want to make sure that you're using the last hole on the governor control arm, and there's only one hole on the throttle. As you can see, as the throttle is increased to the rapid speed, faster RPMs, everything moves. Choke and the governor. Move back to turtle, everything moves back. So it's all one cycle. Next, heat shield will go on. This little lip needs to go underneath of the flywheel cover. And there's one 5/16 bolt that goes in the side right here. The fuel tank is then mounted with 3 5/16 screws. This one right here is already started to make it easier to get the other two started. The fuel tank will need to be lifted up just a hair. to start the second bolt. As that one is now started, come around to the last one, which is right here. Once they're all started, they can all be tightened up. For easier installation of the muffler, the header can be mounted onto the muffler first. This has 3 small washers and 3 10mm nuts. Normally there is a gasket underneath of the header. My gasket broke, so if I was to run this, I would have to order a new one. You would just tighten down 10mm wrench. Next, you're able to install the muffler and header onto the engine. Right before the muffler and header are installed onto the engine, this gasket needs to be put in. Then, the muffler can be installed, and these 2 13mm nuts need to be screwed on.